For this exercise, I've drawn out 5 fruits on my canvas and mixed out 5 pairs of complementary hues that match each fruit. All of the colors on the right are complementary hues. They complement the colors on the left, which are the true hues of each fruit or vegetable. The first step of this exercise is to paint in the values of each veggie using the complementary hue. Painting in values can look like what I'm doing here, where I'm just using that color itself and scumbling/dry brushing it onto the lighter areas. You can also accomplish getting those correct midtones, highlights, and shadows by simply mixing white into the hue that you're using. Just make sure that no matter what method you use to get your values set up, that the lightest highlights are completely pure white and the darkest shadows are completely pure color. We want to shade each fruit or veggie as if we're just coloring them with a graphite pencil. We're not quite thinking about color yet, we're just thinking about value, aka highlights, midtones, and shadows. Now, if you're like, wait girl, we have already gone too far. How am I supposed to know which complementary colors to use, and how did you get yours? Well, this part's easy. It doesn't require any skill or prior knowledge to color theory. All you really need to find complementary hues is a color wheel. You can use a red, yellow, blue color wheel or a CMY color wheel. Whatever colors you're more familiar with works best. And basically, you want to find the true color of each object on that color wheel. For example, a red apple would be red. And then you draw a straight line directly through the center of that color wheel. Whatever hue that this straight line through the center of your color wheel lands on is going to be its opposite hue, or complementary hue. In a CMY color wheel, which is what I like to use, the complementary hue of red is cyan. So I'm using cyan to paint the values of what's going to end up being a red apple. Complementary hues are not only complementary, meaning they really make each other pop when you put them next to each other, they also cancel each other out, meaning that when you combine them together, it pulls their saturation all the way down to black. So the more of our complementary color that we are adding onto our painting in our shadow areas, the darker of a black we'll get when we glaze a transparent layer of the object's true color on top. That's why I've painted all the little sprouts of each fruit magenta, because in CMY, the opposite of magenta is green, and I want all of the little leaves and sprouts to end up being green. If you're not super comfortable shading objects, I totally understand. It can be kind of confusing, especially if you don't have a lot of practice shading in values. But as long as you keep in mind where your source of light is coming from, you'll know exactly where to put those highlights and shadows. The light source on all of my fruits and veggies is coming from the upper right. So I know that the upper rightmost area of all of my fruits needs to be completely white, because that's a highlight color. And if I know where my light is coming from, I'll know exactly where my shadows need to be, opposite of where the highlights are. Kind of like in complementary colors, we know what a complementary color is because it is the complete opposite of what our main color is. And same goes with highlights and shadows. Your shadows will always be opposing your highlights on an object. Now, one thing that can be a little bit tricky with this is making sure you have a proper balance of highlight, midtone, and shadow. This gets tricky simply because it's completely dependent upon which color you're using to glaze over your complementary. The closer that your glaze color, aka the true color or dominant color of your object is, the weaker it's going to hold up against the underpainting color that you're using or the complementary color that you're using. For example, the object I'm painting in this shot is an orange. And orange is just one step away from being yellow, so it's not going to hold up very strongly against this bluish cyan. I can already tell you that this orange is not going to end up looking very realistic because I've already gone way too hard on the blue and not given that orange glaze enough room to breathe and really show its true color. If I had shaded a different colored object like this, say a green object, a red object, or a purple object, it would end up being okay, because the glaze on top would be more of an equal match for this strong underpainting. But you'll see when we go back in to glaze this so-called orange that it definitely doesn't work out in our favor. I needed a way larger area of light highlights and very light midtones to make it work. Thankfully, we do have an example of what we want that to look like when we're leaning towards really yellowish glazes. Here we're shading a banana, and I'm making sure to only use that blue color in the deepest, darkest areas of that banana. And then I'm scumbling in very, very light, gentle midtones for any of the areas of the banana that are slightly darker than the highlight. Since the banana is the ultimate weak color of yellow, we won't need very much of that darker blue color to make it look like there's some shading. It's always better to go a little bit lighter than you think you need to when it comes to this than a little bit darker. So while it might not look like enough shadow to make the banana look realistic with just this one hue in the shading, trust the process that it will look right once we glaze that yellow hue on top. Now we finally get to see what things look like when we glaze. Starting off with our red apple, I'm glazing a fully transparent hue of red over that cyan underpainting. The downside to filming on my phone is that sometimes I just randomly run out of storage space halfway through filming, like I did right here. So there's not much of a satisfying reveal for that apple, but this is what it looks like glazed. Don't worry, we did catch the full glazing process for all the other fruits and veggies though, so let's move on to that pear. This pear is another good example of a proper balance between highlight, midtone, and shadow when we're glazing on top with a color that's similar to yellow. It might not look like it at first, but this green is actually a very yellow leaning green, making it deceptively weak, similarly to that yellow or orange glaze that we were working with earlier. You'll notice that most of this pear is almost completely white or a very light mid-tone hue. And as we glaze that yellowish green on top, it creates the most perfect, gorgeous shading underneath. We can really start to see how these two hues end up canceling each other out in the areas where I've applied that underpainting the darkest. Moving on to our so-called orange, we can pretty much immediately tell that I've made two huge mistakes here. So let my mistakes be a lesson to you. One, as we know, I went way too hard on the cyan blue underpainting. I didn't leave enough room for that orange glaze to really shine on top. But in addition to that, I also mixed out my orange way too red. So we ended up with something that resembles much more of a cherry tomato, but even a tomato would have deserved a lot more room for that red glaze to shine. Mixing out accurate hues for transparent glazes can be challenging because transparent colors always look darker in the pile than they actually do when thinned out across a white surface. So whenever you are mixing out glazed colors, make sure to have a little piece of scrap canvas or paper on the side that allows you to test out those transparent hues. This yellow is a great example of that. In the pile, it is very dark, almost orange, but as we glaze it over this mostly white banana, you can really see the true tone of that yellow shine through. And we're really getting to see what it should look like when we glaze over a properly painted complementary underpainting. Even though this yellow is very light, very transparent, and very weak, we're still getting a gorgeous sense of light and shadow. And of course, we have our one veggie, which is a little broccoli. I wanted to make sure I had at least one example of a darker glaze. This is where it becomes very important to make sure that you are spreading a thin layer of these glazes on top. We don't want a thick layer of paint, we just want a super thin film over each underpainting. That's why it's also incredibly important to make sure that every single one of your glazes is made with transparent pigment only. You can tell if the paint colors that you're using are transparent by checking the paint label or looking it up online. If you happen to be looking it up online, make sure to look it up by the pigment code, not necessarily the name of the color. The pigment itself is what is is going to tell you whether or not that paint is transparent or opaque. Once I've laid in all my glazes, I go in with a paper towel and I rub out a little bit of those highlight areas. This is going to give me even more sense of light and luminescence within those highlighted areas of my glazes. The thinner your glaze, the more of the colors underneath it that are going to shine through. In this case, that white shines through to create very bright, gorgeous highlights. I used acrylic paint for the first layer and oil paint for the second layer on my painting, but you guys can use whatever paints you prefer. I hope you enjoyed this demo. Thank you so much for watching. And if you want to see more of this educational content, subscribe to my Patreon.